You should want the housing market to crash. To understand why, we have to look at the 5 key factors used to rig the market and the social and economic consequences. While we're looking at the UK, this deeply damaging illusion of safety is present in almost every developed economy. Different policy names, same results. So first off, how do we know that the housing market is massively overpriced? Using data from Nationwide, we can see that the average house price in 2000 was approximately £80,000. By 2025 it was approximately £272,000. Now adjusted for inflation, that should cost about £177,000. So that's nearly £100,000 of magical new value. Looking at the Office for National Statistics median wage, in 2000 it was £18,600. Today it's £39,000. So in 25 years, a house has gone from costing 4.3 times the average salary to 6.97. In London it's a comically high 13. And 2000 is not a cherry-picked year. The historic long-term average is around 3.8. Another less commonly used measure of value is replacement cost. The bricks and mortar combined with labour and a notional value attributed to a small plot of land are in almost every case a much lower number than a house's market value. In other words, at today's prices you're not getting any sort of value for money, but instead have the privilege of owning an inflated asset. Now this absurd rise is due to many factors, many of which stem directly from the government trying to prop up the housing market. Before we explain these effects, why is the government so keen to keep the bubble going? Well, self-interest. No one's going to get re-elected during a housing crash. In countries with an unhealthy economic dependence on the property sector, a prolonged and serious downturn is going to lead to a sharp and deep recession. Governments also depend on taxing the economic activity associated with a vibrant housing market. If the market fell by 30%, the UK's dodgy measure of GDP would collapse. Retirement plans for millions who treat their houses as pensions would evaporate, and the banks who are leveraged to the hilt in property debt may require another bailout a la 2008. One of the most important factors contributing to this housing bubble is factor 1, financial repression. In many markets, real interest rates have been held at negative levels, meaning the purchasing power of money decreases over time, making it bad for savers but good for borrowers as debt costs less in real terms. And this acts like an invisible thief, punishing savers and forcing capital to flee devaluing bank accounts in search of stable returns. And given how the economy has been set up, the answer was in property. When you pair this with highly leveraged banks and near 0% interest rates, 3 to 4% mortgages are hugely in demand. And this creates a perverse impact where demand exists not just from the people wanting homes, but from investors wanting to buy other people's mortgages in the form of mortgage-backed securities, which are essentially bundles of debt sold as safe investment. It's worth remembering that the market demand for these mortgage-backed securities, along with heavy doses of dangerous financial engineering, which we're not going to get into here, eventually led to the 2008 financial crash in the first place. By making debt cheap, central banks didn't make housing any more affordable. They simply allowed house buyers to bid up prices based on manageable monthly payments rather than the home's intrinsic value. And this creates a destructive feedback loop, where the housing market stops being a provider of shelter and becomes a capital sink for speculators and desperate savers, eventually decoupling house prices from wages until the entire market is no longer a reflection of reality, but a direct measurement of how much cheap debt the system is willing to inject. Our second factor which contributes is government-fueled demand. And the government has used several other schemes aimed at helping people buy homes, which are really about continuing the increase in demand for housing. Help to Buy or equity loans resulted simply in housing deposits being partially government subsidised. Meanwhile, ISA subsidies merely increased the pool of capital competing for a limited supply of houses. And this pairs very nicely with factor 3, government restricted supply, where very restricted planning regimes are unwilling to release land for development, especially in the green belt. And the lack of supply of new housing where people actually want to live is chronic in countless territories. Factor 4, outside of the government's control, is demographics. because although low fertility rates will eventually result in a falling global population, the current trend is still upwards. More people and more economic development has massively increased the flow of populations into the major cities, with insufficient provision of new homes, therefore putting pressure on prices, along with increased immigration into popular Western countries. Factor 5, and another really important one, is the safety nets for speculators, most notably mortgage guarantee schemes. A 95% LTV mortgage is a high leverage loan where you borrow 95% of the property's price and provide only a 5% deposit on the house, leaving you with almost no equity and making you extremely vulnerable to negative equity if house prices fall even slightly. They're sadly needed because in the UK, many people struggle to build enough capital to pay a larger deposit on an overpriced house while simultaneously dealing with overpriced rent. In a free market, banks would rarely give out such loans because of the risks, but the UK government steps in as the guarantor, and this encourages banks to continue reckless lending at the top of the cycle because they know that the taxpayer will eat the loss if the mortgage fails, therefore pumping more and more debt into the housing market to further prop up demand. And all of this is a perfect alignment of incentives, where every intermediary from the lender to the agent to the government benefits from the public's debt-fueled desperation. In a healthy market, those providing a poor service will be outcompeted, and thus the consumer will get a better service. In this rigged market, where the suppliers can't lose, everyone from house builders to estate agents get away with shoddy service that causes the public to lose out as a whole. It's an utterly parasitic series of industries that have all grown very wealthy during this prolonged boom. Additionally, by subsidising rent through housing benefit to the tune of approximately 25 to 30 billion a year, the government provides a guaranteed yield for buy-to-let landlords. And this makes a property a can't-lose investment, further driving up the entry price for first-time buyers who are competing with these would-be landlords. A recent study by the University of Glasgow laughably concluded that stimulating the housing market could be an effective way of growing the Scottish economy. Outside of how funny it is to imagine that some think government should or even could do more to inflate the market, far too many experts wrongly consider spending on residential housing and real infrastructure spending to have equal merit. They do not. Spending on real infrastructure like roads, rails, and airports, etc. has a lasting positive impact on economic development. Residential housing doesn't. It may have a one-off impact on our questionable measure of GDP, that's it, no more. So with a housing market so massively propped up by government policy as well as some other external factors, who's benefited and who's been hurt? Obviously, property owners who bought much earlier, i.e. the old, have enjoyed massive and largely unearned increases in their home equity and net wealth, as well as obviously property speculators. Most businesses operating in the broader real estate sector, from real estate agents and mortgage brokers to kitchen and bathroom suppliers and building contractors, have done well. Landlords, both private and institutional, who've been able to exploit shortages to push up rents, have been big winners. Meanwhile, landowners, if they've been successful in achieving planning permission, have enjoyed a huge development gains on sale. Governments who squeeze a lot of tax revenue out of the sector and can claim the economy is healthy based on house prices are also winners. Losers? Well, in our opinion, recent buyers who have typically borrowed huge sums to get on the property ladder at a time where prices may well have peaked. Not only do they risk negative equity, but they're also stuck paying off grotesquely overinflated amounts on their mortgages due to the state of the market. Precious few will tell them of the circumstances of their purchase and the likelihood of regretting it. Many, if not most people in my generation, have no chance of buying at these price levels without massive help from their families. So in turn, young people out of necessity are being forced into the rental market, which is also inflated. So why should we want the housing market to crash? Well, let's look at the issues. Far from being a place to live, housing has become an asset for reckless speculators who have taken on huge debts to invest in property at record prices and have been bailed out by desperate governments. And these property magnates are not geniuses. They made what should have been losing bets in a fair marketplace, but just so happened to have been in the timeline where their bad bets were bailed out by governments using every financial lever at their disposal to rig this marketplace. It's survivor bias taken to an extreme, where the belief is that this is the way the housing market is, as opposed to this is a very tenuous state of affairs. They're standing on a trapdoor and feeling smug because the hinge was jammed. Their wealth is a government subsidy they've mistakenly attributed to their own talent. Meanwhile, most people are stuck paying off overinflated mortgages to the bank or stuck paying overinflated rents, unable to buy their first home at all. The overinvestment in property is a terrible capital misallocation. Billions of pounds that should have gone into startups, technology and infrastructure instead sunk into houses which don't actually use the capital. Indeed, there are many who question the quality of new built homes, even at the top end of the market, due to the blatant profiteering. Young people who would have started a business are too afraid to take that risk because their mortgage or rent is so high that they have zero margin for error. Because of this, it's very difficult to count just how much we've lost out on in potential businesses because of the property market. Lower house prices that are back in line with the historical average are good for the economy as a whole. A crash would reduce the friction costs of life. It makes the country cheaper to run, makes our exports more competitive and our workforce more dynamic, enables greater workforce mobility and ensures future generations aren't priced out of home ownership. It helps family formation and increases disposable income, which will benefit the wider economy. The only people who truly argue against this are those who rely on the rigged system as a financial crutch, most notably the speculators. The inflated market's contribution to falling birth rates is significant not only for society as a whole, but also because fewer young people will be around to pay for many parts of the economy. Not only the likes of government pension schemes and other tax-based expenses, but also the demand side of the property market. So who's going to step in to buy these homes? Well, either the property market crashes or we get something far worse. Maybe the end game is to sell more and more of our property to investment groups as an asset to be added to their collection. Maybe my niece and nephew's generation can forget the concept of home ownership altogether and get used to the idea of leasing from BlackRock or the Saudi investment fund forever. We become a nation of renters, increasingly priced out to where the very idea of owning your own home may become a lost ideal. Neo-feudalism is hardly a happy outcome. Now, I'm not a fortune teller. I can't tell you exactly how all this will play out, nor the exact date that the market will crash. But I can say definitively that you should want the housing market to crash, because it would return some sort of sanity into a market so long deprived of it. The amusing part of this is how many supposed experts will tell you that this is just how housing is, that prices like this are inevitable. If the government rescinded every policy we have mentioned here that artificially inflates the market, it would crash overnight. As the old saying goes, excrement floats. And in the housing market, an awful lot of excrement has been carried by an ever-rising tide for a very long time. So what should you do about all this? Nothing. If you're in a nice property and can afford the payments, that's fine. Perhaps drop the idea that the equity in your house will be your pension. If you're someone in my generation with understandable aspirations to own your own home, you have our collective sympathies. Try to be patient. If you're a property speculator or a landlord with multi-home ownership, you probably clicked away from this truth quite a while ago. But they won't be able to click away forever, because at some point this will end. At some point there's simply no more the demand side can take, and buyers stop buying, even though it's hard because they need a place to live. Housing markets do crash. And given the already Herculean efforts of the government here in the UK to both bail out the banks in 2008 and uphold the current state of affairs, it's not clear how much more they'll be able to bend over backwards to prop up this market. Now, to be honest, we've been bearish on the housing market for a while. Indeed, we watched housing prices rise in response to COVID-19. If a worldwide pandemic and economic shock can't knock the market off course, you may wonder what on earth can. Don't for a minute underestimate the resilience of this marketplace and the determination of those incentivized to keep it standing. Damn the costs. For most people, the adage that you never lose money owning bricks and mortar has proved to be spot on. When you're right for so long, it's very hard to imagine ever being wrong. But one day, you will be. And despite how many will see it, the short-term pain will be worth the long-term benefit. This grotesque charade must come to an end. That's why you should want the housing market to crash. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.